There's a document sitting in the National Archives that most Americans can quote a fragment of without ever having read the whole thing. George Washington wrote it in 1796 as he prepared to leave office, and it contains one warning that has echoed through nearly every major American foreign policy debate since. He warned the young republic against permanent alliances, against letting the ambitions of other nations drag America into conflicts that weren't fundamentally its own to fight. For more than 2 centuries, that warning has been debated, ignored, revived, and reinterpreted by every generation facing its own version of the same question. Right now, in the summer of 2026, it's being tested again, not in some abstract policy seminar, but in the waters off Egypt, where a drone strike on a gas terminal just did something no single attack in this war has done before. It connected 2 choke points America was already struggling to manage into a third one, sitting almost literally in NATO's backyard. To understand why this moment matters as much as it does, you need the full shape of what's already happened, because this war didn't start with a threat to the Suez Canal. It started back on February 28th with a coordinated American and Israeli strike campaign against Iran, one that killed Iran's supreme leader in its opening hours and set off a chain of retaliation that has now run for more than 5 months without a lasting resolution. Iran's answer to overwhelming conventional military inferiority was to reach for the one lever it actually controls: geography. It effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow channel through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas normally travels. That single move turned a regional war into a global economic event, pushing oil prices to levels the International Energy Agency has described as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. For months, the story was Hormuz, and Hormuz alone, a single choke point absorbing the world's attention while ships rerouted, insurance premiums spiked, and diplomats searched for an exit. But wars like this one rarely stay contained to a single pressure point, because the same logic that made Hormuz so devastatingly effective as a weapon exists in other narrow waterways too. In late July, that logic extended itself. On July 22nd, after a pause of roughly 9 months, Houthi forces in Yemen, longtime allies of Iran, resumed attacks on vessels in the Red Sea, this time directly targeting ships tied to Saudi Arabia. That reopened the second choke point in this crisis, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow gateway between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden that carries more than a tenth of the world's seaborne oil trade and roughly a quarter of global container shipping. For countries trying to route around the closure of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb had been the workaround. Suddenly, the workaround itself was under threat. And then, just 1 week later, on July 29th, something happened that had never happened before in this entire war. A drone attack struck 2 vessels in the Egyptian port city of Damietta on the Mediterranean coast, setting fire to a floating storage and regasification unit and a nearby tanker. No group has formally claimed responsibility, but the location alone tells you almost everything you need to know about what's actually at stake here. Damietta isn't just any port. It sits near the northern approach to the Suez Canal, the 120-mile waterway that has connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea since 1869, and which, alongside its associated pipeline network, remains one of the handful of choke points the entire global trading system depends on functioning normally. For the first time in this war, an attack landed at the edge of the third major maritime choke point tied to this conflict, not near Iran, not in the Gulf, not even in the Red Sea itself, but at the northern gateway to the Mediterranean. It's worth pausing here to explain exactly why this progression, Hormuz, then Bab el-Mandeb, then Suez, is so much more dangerous than any single closure on its own. Analysts who study maritime security have long referred to Bab el-Mandeb as a kind of relief valve for the oil market during the Hormuz crisis. When Gulf producers like Saudi Arabia couldn't move oil out through the Strait of Hormuz, they redirected shipments overland to Red Sea ports and sent them north through Bab el-Mandeb instead. That workaround absorbed a meaningful share of the disruption for months. But if Bab el-Mandeb itself becomes unreliable, the next available option is to reroute tankers even further north, through the Suez Canal and its associated summed pipeline, adding weeks to journey times, but at least offering a viable path to the Mediterranean and onward to Europe. If that route also becomes unsafe, there is no plan C left inside the region. The only remaining option is the same one shipping companies used during earlier Red Sea crises, diverting entirely around the Cape of Good Hope, adding roughly 4 weeks and enormous additional cost to a journey that used to take a fraction of that time. 3 choke points, effectively neutralized in sequence, would mean the global economy loses not just one shortcut, but every shortcut simultaneously. There's also a historical irony sitting quietly underneath this specific waterway that's worth naming, because the Suez Canal has already been the site of one of the 20th century's defining lessons about how quickly a regional dispute can become a global crisis with a fractured alliance at its center. In 1956, Britain, France, and Israel launched a coordinated military operation to seize the canal after Egypt's president nationalized it, only for the United States, under President Eisenhower, to publicly break with its own closest allies and force a withdrawal, fundamentally reshaping the post-war order and accelerating the decline of European colonial influence in the region. That crisis is remembered today as a turning point precisely because it revealed how thoroughly the old assumptions about alliance solidarity could collapse the moment underlying national interests diverged. 70 years later, the roles have shifted in an almost inverted way. Now it's Washington asking European allies for military support around a choke point crisis, and it's European governments doing the declining. Whether that inversion is coincidence or evidence of some deeper cyclical pattern in how great powers relate to their allies during Suez-adjacent crises is, admittedly, more of an interesting historical observation than a firm conclusion, but it's hard not to notice. The economic stakes attached to this specific waterway also deserve to be stated plainly, because they explain why even a single unclaimed drone strike near its northern approach generated as much attention as it did. Roughly 12% of global trade by volume has historically moved through the Suez Canal and its surrounding shipping lanes in an ordinary year, connecting Asian manufacturing centers to European consumer markets far faster than any alternative route. The canal itself cannot handle the very largest oil tankers in the global fleet, but the adjoining Sumd pipeline, which carries crude overland between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean coast, fills exactly that gap, moving well over 1 million barrels a day, even in ordinary times. A sustained disruption to either the canal or the pipeline doesn't just add weeks to shipping schedules, it removes one of the last remaining pressure release valves in a global energy and trade system that, thanks to the earlier closures of Hormuz and now Bab el-Mandeb, was already operating with almost no spare capacity left to absorb another shock. It's worth adding one more layer of nuance here, because the picture isn't simply one of uniform, escalating danger everywhere at once. Egypt has powerful, independent incentives to prevent exactly the outcome this documentary has been describing. Suez Canal revenues have historically provided billions of dollars a year in foreign currency for a government that depends heavily on that income. And Cairo has invested substantially in its own naval and coastal security capabilities specifically to protect the waterway, well before this particular war ever began. Egyptian officials have every reason to move quickly and visibly to reassure shipping companies and insurers that the canal remains secure, distinct from whatever is happening in Yemen or the Persian Gulf. That gives this story a genuine open question rather than a predetermined outcome. Does Egypt's own strong incentive to protect the canal prove sufficient to contain this threat locally, the way it has largely succeeded in doing during previous, smaller flare-ups near the Red Sea? Or does the specific combination of a war already spanning 2 other major choke points, plus a domestic security apparatus that, however capable, cannot fully monitor every drone or unmarked vessel approaching from international waters, mean this time is structurally different? Reasonable analysts looking at the same set of facts are currently landing in different places on that question, and it may be weeks or months before enough evidence accumulates to settle it either way. There's a reason a shipping analyst tracking this crisis described the situation using a kind of traffic light map, red alerts stacking up one after another across Turkish straits, Suez, Hormuz, and Bab el-Mandeb, all within the same widening arc of instability. It is possible that this sequence is a coincidence of overlapping regional conflicts, Houthi grievances against Saudi Arabia, unclaimed drone strikes near Egypt, Iranian pressure on Hormuz, each with its own separate logic. It's also possible, as some analysts argue, that what we're watching is closer to a coordinated strategy of escalation, Iran and its regional allies methodically expanding the number of choke points under threat specifically because each additional pressure point multiplies the economic and political cost of the war for everyone outside the immediate conflict, without requiring Iran to win a single additional battle on the ground. Both interpretations are consistent with what's publicly known. Neither can be confirmed with full certainty from the outside, and it would be irresponsible to claim otherwise. What can be said with more confidence is what this expanding threat means for the country that has until now treated this largely as a Middle Eastern problem to be managed from a comfortable distance, much of Europe. The Suez Canal isn't simply a commercial artery. It also functions as NATO's southern maritime flank, the corridor connecting the alliance's Mediterranean members to the wider world beyond the Red Sea. A sustained threat to safe passage through Suez doesn't just raise shipping costs for European importers, it raises a genuinely uncomfortable strategic question for an alliance that has, up to this point, mostly watched this war from the sidelines. What happens when the choke point under threat isn't somewhere distant like the Persian Gulf, but sits at the edge of the alliance's own southern border? This is exactly the moment where Washington's warning from 1796 becomes more than a historical footnote, because it speaks directly to the tension now facing every government watching this crisis widen. In his farewell address, Washington argued that the young United States should avoid what he called permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, cautioning that entangling America's fate too closely with the passions and rivalries of other nations would inevitably drag the country into conflicts that serve someone else's interests more than its own. For most of the 20th century, the American foreign policy establishment treated that advice as, at best, a historical curiosity, something to be respectfully cited and then quietly set aside in favor of a globally engaged, alliance-centered strategy built around NATO, forward-deployed forces, and a web of mutual defense commitments spanning the globe. That architecture assumed reciprocity. America extends security guarantees to its allies, and in moments of genuine global crisis, allies reciprocate with meaningful support. We've already seen, over just the past several months, how strained that assumption has become. When President Trump asked NATO members, along with Japan, South Korea, and others, to send warships to help secure the Strait of Hormuz, the overwhelming response was refusal. Germany's defense minister said plainly this wasn't Germany's war. Britain's prime minister said the same, insisting his country wouldn't be pulled into a conflict it hadn't started. That refusal was, in its own way, an eerily modern echo of Washington's original warning, just inverted. Rather than America avoiding entanglement in the disputes of others, America's own allies were the ones declining entanglement in a war Washington itself had initiated without much consultation beforehand. Now, with the threat spreading to the Suez Canal and NATO's own southern flank, that dynamic faces a much harder test, because the calculus for European governments changes considerably once the choke point under threat isn't a distant waterway between Iran and Oman, but a corridor sitting at the edge of their own security architecture. It's one thing to decline sending warships to help secure a war in someone else's ocean. It's a different question entirely when instability starts lapping at your own southern border. Some officials and analysts have already begun framing the Damietta attack precisely this way, as the moment the Iran war stopped being a Gulf problem and became, at least potentially, a European one. It's worth being honest about the counterargument here too, because there's a serious case to be made on the other side, and it deserves a fair hearing rather than a dismissal. One could argue that a single unclaimed drone attack on two vessels, however alarming, is not the same as a sustained blockade, and that treating it as proof of an imminent Suez crisis risks overstating a single data point into a sweeping strategic narrative. Egypt has a strong, independent interest in keeping the canal open, since it generates billions of dollars in annual revenue for a government that badly needs it, and Cairo has its own robust naval and security apparatus dedicated to protecting the waterway, quite apart from anything NATO or Washington chooses to do. It's entirely possible that this attack proves to be an isolated incident, absorbed and contained the way earlier scattered Red Sea attacks eventually were, rather than the opening move in a genuine third front. Skepticism about drawing too large a conclusion from one strike is a reasonable, defensible position, and history offers plenty of examples of crises that seemed poised to spiral and instead fizzled out. But even skeptics of the immediate alarm tend to agree on one underlying point. The mere fact that this attack became possible at all reveals something important about how far this war has already traveled from its original boundaries. 5 months ago, a strike near the Suez Canal tied to this conflict would have seemed like an extreme, almost implausible escalation. Today, it's simply the latest entry on a growing list of maritime flashpoints connected to the same underlying war. Wars have a way of expanding their own geography over time, not always through deliberate strategy, but often through the simple accumulation of smaller actors, each with their own grievances, joining a conflict that started as something narrower. The Houthis attacking Saudi shipping in the Red Sea aren't fighting the same war America and Israel are fighting against Iran's nuclear and missile programs, not exactly, but their actions are shaped by and now increasingly entangled with that larger conflict. And the result is a widening zone of maritime risk that no single government, American, Israeli, Iranian, or European, fully controls anymore. That loss of centralized control is, in some ways, the most important and least discussed feature of where this war now stands. In its opening weeks, this was a conflict with two primary decision-makers on each side. Washington and Jerusalem on one, Tehran on the other. 5 months later, it increasingly resembles something closer to an ecosystem of semi-autonomous actors: Iran's central government, the Houthis in Yemen, unclaimed drone operators near Egyptian ports, each capable of independently escalating tension at a different choke point, often without clear coordination or centralized command. That's a genuinely difficult environment for diplomacy to operate in, because a ceasefire negotiated between Washington and Tehran doesn't automatically bind the Houthis, and a de-escalation in the Persian Gulf doesn't necessarily prevent an unclaimed strike near the Suez Canal from someone with entirely separate motives. The war, in other words, may have outgrown the two governments that started it. This is where Washington's 2-century-old warning intersects with a genuinely new kind of strategic problem, one the founding generation could never have anticipated. Washington worried about permanent alliances dragging America into wars chosen by other sovereign governments, deliberate conflicts with clear decision-makers on each side who could, in principle, also choose to make peace. What's unfolding across these three choke points looks different. A war that started with two clear belligerents has metastasized into something closer to a diffuse, multi-actor crisis, where the risk isn't just entanglement in someone else's deliberate war, but entanglement in a spreading instability that increasingly has no single author and no single off-ramp. If the original warning was about avoiding foreign quarrels you didn't choose, the 21st century version might be about the far harder problem of trying to exit a foreign quarrel that keeps generating new participants faster than diplomats can negotiate with the old ones. It's also worth considering how this affects the calculations of countries well outside the immediate region, because choke point disruptions rarely stay confined to the parties directly involved in shipping through them. Asian exporters relying on the fastest route to European markets, European importers dependent on affordable energy and manufactured goods arriving on predictable schedules, and insurance underwriters pricing war risk into every policy covering a Mediterranean or Red Sea transit, all now have to factor in a scenario that seemed almost unthinkable at the start of this year. 3 major choke points, spanning thousands of miles, simultaneously carrying elevated risk premiums because of a single, still unresolved war. That kind of compounding uncertainty tends to produce its own economic drag well before any choke point is actually closed, because shipping companies, insurers, and governments start planning around the possibility of disruption long before disruption becomes a certainty. So where does that leave the calculations happening right now in European capitals, in Washington and in Cairo? If the Suez Canal genuinely becomes the third choke point under sustained threat, the pressure on NATO members to reconsider their earlier refusal will intensify considerably, not because the alliance's founding purpose has changed, but because the geography of the threat will have moved measurably closer to territory NATO has always considered its own responsibility to protect. That could produce one of two very different outcomes. It could finally push European governments toward the kind of coordinated naval response Washington has been requesting since the crisis began, reasoning that a threat to their own southern flank is fundamentally different from a distant war in someone else's Gulf. Or just as plausibly, it could deepen the reluctance already on display as governments conclude that getting involved now, after months of visible escalation and no clear resolution in sight, carries even greater risk than it did back when this was framed as purely a Hormuz problem. Which path Europe actually takes is not yet knowable, and any documentary claiming certainty about it would be overstating what the evidence currently supports. What is clearer is this: the countries most exposed to this expanding crisis are increasingly being forced to confront the exact tension Washington identified in 1796, just in a form far more tangled than anything his generation could have imagined. Should a nation's security architecture be built around permanent alliances and mutual defense commitments, even when those commitments risk pulling you into conflicts whose origins, actors, and endpoints are only partially within anyone's control? Or does true sovereignty mean drawing a harder line, engaging only when your own immediate interests are unmistakably at stake, even if that means watching your closest allies absorb costs alone? There is no version of this choice that comes without real trade-offs, and the nations now watching a drone strike near the Suez Canal are being forced to make that choice in real time, with far less clarity than any policymaker would prefer. The real question, then, isn't simply whether the Suez Canal becomes the next major flashpoint in this war, or whether this specific attack near Damietta turns out to be an isolated incident or the opening chapter of something larger. The real question is whether the very idea of a contained regional war still exists in a world this interconnected, where a strike on 2 vessels off the Egyptian coast can, within hours, become a referendum on 230-year-old advice about entangling alliances. Because if a single conflict really can widen from 1 choke point to 3 within the span of 5 months, with no clear ceiling yet in sight, then the question every government now has to sit with isn't just about Iran or Suez or NATO's southern flank specifically. It's about whether Washington's warning was ever really about avoiding the wars other nations start, or whether it was quietly anticipating something closer to this. A world so tightly interconnected that no war, however contained it first appears, ever really stays that way for long.